on online safety at the Alan Turing Institute, where her work focuses on online hate and abuse, misinformation, extremism, and the uptake of safety technologies. Prior to this, her roles include supporting the policymakers in the UK Parliament on the forthcoming online safety bill, as well as working with big data analytics at the United Nations. I'm also joined by my colleague at Clifford Chance, Ioana Burtea, who works with me alongside me at the tech group focusing on online safety and has previously also worked on intermediary liability issues at the Stanford University Policy Unit. And lastly, I'm Arnav Joshi. I'm a senior associate at Clifford Chance as part of the tech group. A lot of my work focuses on digital regulation, and I also lead the firm's working group on digital ethics. Now, as a number of us working in this space for many years have foreshadowed, over the last few years, regulators in Europe have been undertaking the arduous task of translating many of the core principles that underlie digital ethics, accountability, fairness, transparency, the mitigation of harm into law and guidance. Among this clutch of laws is the UK's Online Safety Bill. The bill aims to deliver the British government's manifesto commitment to make the UK the safest place in the world to be online while defending free expression. Not an easy task to accomplish, as I'm sure we can all imagine. It comes at a time where a number of other countries, including Canada, Australia, and of course the European Union, have come up with similar legislation in the recent past. Most recently, the EU's Digital Services Act, entering into force towards the middle of last month. Although it's quite broad in its scope, there's specific focus in the bill on protecting children online, with obligations ranging from preventing access to harmful content, acting on reported violations, age verification, and transparency. At its core, the bill establishes rules for user-to-user services and for search engines. Under the current draft, these are internet services through which content that's generated directly on the service by a user of the service, uploaded to or shared on the service by a user of that service, may be encountered by another user or users of the service. There's a very specific reason I've chosen to use that definition, which is hot off the press as of yesterday morning. And we'll get to more on that in a bit. The bill includes provisions for fines of up to 10% of annual revenue, or in the most serious cases, being blocked by the regulator and also by court-mandated orders. Since it was first published, the scope of the bill has been expanded to include a number of areas, such as fraudulent advertising, priority offences based on recommendations from the UK Law Commission, identity verification, and others. It's also yo-yoed on a number of issues and has sometimes been referred to as the Frankenstein's monster of online legislation in the UK, attempting to tackle issues such as free speech and sometimes drawing the fine line in quickly evolving context of content that may be legal but still harmful, and what organizations are likely to be in scope in the bill's tiered approach to regulation and compliance requirements. How some of these organizations will actually meet these requirements remains to be seen, particularly when it comes to monitoring online content, age assurance, and user empowerment. With that really brief overview, I'm going to pass over to Ioana, who is going to deep dive on some of the recent changes and some of the particularly contentious provisions in the bill, and then over to Pica for her presentation. And we apologize in advance. This was meant to be a much more interactive session involving having a look at the Turing Institute's Online Harms Observatory. But as you've seen, we've had a few tech issues, so Pica is bravely going to be speaking to her presentation instead.
Thanks, Arnav. So, as I'm sure many of you already know, there's been a lot of change on the online safety bill. Just yesterday, the fourth iteration was published following a statement from DCMS last week on a number of very big picture changes to the online safety bill. Before I get into the meat of those changes, I just wanted to briefly run over the who and the what of the online safety bill, just to give everyone a bit of grounding. So the online safety bill covers two types of services. user-to-user services or any internet service that allows users to upload and generate content and share it with other users, and search services, which are predominantly search engines. Within that, you have a tiering system. So category 1, which has the most stringent obligations, covers user-to-user services that, fairly similar to the EU counterparts DSA, covers very large organizations, although we haven't been given much further guidance. We understand it's going to be quite a limited number of user-to-user services, though. Then category 2A and B on search services, and the remaining user-to-users also has their own sets of obligations imposed upon them. As Arnav mentioned, that list of obligations is quite broad and covers a very long range of different offenses and considerations. What happened in the last week was a change to the scope of online harms, as well as how the Online Safety Bill approaches those obligations. So currently, there's a lot of duties of care imposed on these Category 1 and Category 2 services. That ranges from requirements to undertake risk assessments, either in respect of illegal content or for services likely to be accessed by children, for instance. It also covers content moderation, obligations to preemptively remove content, and we'll talk a bit more about that with Pica's guidance shortly, as well as user empowerment and transparency obligations. And that's transparency both with respect to the users on these services and with respect to the regulators. And I think the real interesting bit is both content moderation and how that then ties into transparency. So those are going to be the two main areas we'll focus on. Of course, if you have any questions about other parts of the bill, we're very happy to pick them up at the Q&A session at the end. In the last week, some of the main announcements that have come through on how the bill is going to tackle have shifted the focus to safety and design. There's a much greater focus on focusing on entities' own terms of services and how that's going to tie into the overall scope. So turning now to content moderation, which had the biggest and most widely written about change. The Online Safety Bill originally covered legal content as well as legal but harmful content. As many of you, I'm sure, know and have considered this, it's quite a controversial topic to cover this content, which for all intents and purposes is legal, but now has very heavy regulatory obligations imposed on services how to tackle it. So following months of debate, it was announced that this would be removed from the bill. It's important to note that the draft that was published yesterday doesn't yet reflect a lot of these major changes, so we don't yet know exactly what the removal of legal but harmful content. We saw a number of additional amendments were tabled just this morning that we've been quickly trying to catch up on, so please bear with us as more guidance emerges, I'm sure, over the course of today and over the coming weeks. But it's possible that legal but harmful content will be entirely removed from the bill. It's also possible that what we'll see with the introduction of focus on terms of service, which do cover a very broad range of content that goes far beyond legal content in most cases, we'll see some element of this concept of very broad, harmful content still be retained. To give a bit more grounding on that as well, the original definition of harmful content that's still in the bill as of yesterday's draft is content which poses a material risk that significant harm will occur to an appreciable number of adults in the UK, which arguably sets quite a high threshold. It's not an individualistic definition. whereas terms of service definitions could actually go broader than that definition for harmful content. So really, it's a very interesting time to be considering content moderation when you have this vast range of possible definitions and quite a lot of different types of content for companies to get to grips with. The other part of online harms that's covered by the bill is so-called priority offenses, which allow the regulator, Ofcom, to fast-track enforcement for certain types of content. This list originally was quite constrained to sexual exploitation, content relating to drugs or weapons, very high-level harms. And we've seen a gradual increase in that list of priority offenses as more content has been added to the bill. It's expected that additional offenses such as those related to advocacy for self-harm to users online will be added, although again, we've only seen very preliminary drafts of what those additional offenses could look like, although we're operating on the assumption that those will come through quite soon. In yesterday's bill, one of the new inclusions for this offenses list as well was on epilepsy bullying online, so showing flashing images to users. And I think that's another very interesting point from a technical perspective for entities to consider, because you're no longer in the range of content that's textual. It could be multimedia, it could be just light coming from a screen, and it's going to be very difficult for entities to grapple with such a broad list of harms and such a fast-paced environment. So I'll hand over to Pica now to share her insights on how organizations could be thinking about content moderation, especially when it goes beyond illegal content.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. As mentioned, we had a deck to show and an introduction to what the Alan Turing Institute calls the Online Harms Observatory, which is a set of dashboards, which we wanted to demo today. But I'm happy to do that individually with anyone later. But to pick up where we kind of left off, I'm from the Alan Turing Institute. It's the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI, where I work with questions of online safety and really trying to build better AI for the purposes of online safety. So I think obviously the bill in many ways turns to these very automatized and technical solutions for solving some of these problems, or at least trying to identify a lot of the harms. And I think where we are uniquely positioned is that we are a research institute that sits between the government, the regulators, and academia, in terms of really being able to keep up to date in terms of what is technically feasible and possible as of right now when it comes to identifying and finding some of these harms that we do see online. I think one of the main things that we are trying to emphasize when it comes to the online safety bill is that not all of these harms, especially not the ones you were talking about just a while ago that came very early, are so-called big data problems. And I think that's something we really should be wary of when we think about how and to what degree you can use AI to identify these types of content online, because the further down the list we come, especially to these more recent additions to the priority offenses, those might be moving more and more into the space of things that we can use, text, image, sometimes voice recordings or combinations of them, so multimodal content, to be able to use AI to actually track and identify them. But a lot of the really early offenses that we saw on the list, these are actually not big end problems. These are probably problems that will not be tackled with AI, even if it's something that a lot of people seem to be, putting pressure, or they see that that's like the one solution to being able to tackle what exists within the scope of the bill. And of course that will require much more police work or investigative type work that's not going to be approached from the methods that we use. But that being said, the research that we are currently undertaking covers many different aspects of kind of what we've been talking about today. But the main platform that we are currently working on is what we call the Online Harms Observatory. It is a set of dashboards that each track a type of harm. Now we're looking at abuse and hate, and the target that we've been looking at right now, and very, very topical because of the World Cup. It was a report commissioned by Ofcom and supported by DCMS to look at abuse and hate in sports. So the initial one that we looked at was for the Premier League football players within the past couple of two seasons. I believe we're now tracking for a second round of data for policymakers to be able to log in real time have access to this data themselves. So we are putting out both academic research with our latest models to be able to contribute to the wider community and the knowledge and the understanding we have of these areas, primarily using adversarial learning and active learning, but also now looking into how you can use models and use what's called domain shift or domain transfer learning to use these once very specialized models in very data efficient ways to then be able to use those models for tracking lots of different types of online harms and online content. So when I say that we have one tracker live as of now that looks at football, we're working very closely, for example, with Ofcom to see, what is basically the minimum amount of data that we can use to be able to use a model trained for one thing to then be able to actually utilize it for lots of different types of online harms. So this is really a type of partnership that we're increasingly trying to work both with DCMS and in Ofcom to go into these more technical collaborations when it comes to learning and helping them upskill in many ways, because we do have access to both the data and that's data that we scrape, so it's not something that we're going into collaborations with tech platforms to necessarily get, but we are kind of an independent, publicly funded body that sits between these data sources and civil society and anyone else maybe that want to have access to this data and really use it as an evidence base to start getting a much better understanding of what needs to be done online and what the bill actually needs to tackle. Because I think what we noticed when we started looking into how we could use data to support policymakers, we noticed that in this space there's just a huge lack of data. So it really comes down to civil society and campaign groups to advocate for very specific causes, which is obviously they're incredibly important harms that we now see in this list. But where we want to step in is to try to help and build an evidence base that covers many, many years of time. And also, of course, when the bill actually does pass, we will be able to have a stock of data and this bulk of knowledge that we can look back and really be able to trace over time how these big policy changes have affected the way that people communicate with each other online. So that's just a little bit of a brief overview to hear more about what we are doing in this space. And I'm happy to look at the set of dashboards with anyone later.
Yeah, which is a really helpful overview. Thanks, Pica, and thanks for speaking to what would have been otherwise a very interactive presentation from you. I think it's a really interesting point that you make where, given the sort of very, very wide scope of what not just regulators but organizations dealing with millions, sometimes billions of users have to actually deal with on a day-to-day basis, Ioana covered the sort of very thorny subject of legal but harmful that regulators are trying to grapple with. As some of you who've been following work in this space more broadly will know, when it comes to the Digital Services Act, they've sort of, I would say, sidestepped. Perhaps they're better placed than we are. We're not sure. The jury's still out on that point. But the DSA sort of largely focuses on illegal content and focuses on what should and should not be legal, rather than getting into the realm of legal but harmful. And that's an issue that I think it's going to be very interesting to see where we come out at the other end of, particularly for the ethicists in the room. As you know, these are sort of concepts of harm and what should and should not be harmful, or what is and is not appreciable to lots of different types of users on lots of different types of services online is a question that's been debated for tens, if not hundreds of years, and regulators trying to pin that down into a regulation that in a space that's as fast moving as this is certainly a really interesting challenge. One of the things that Ofcom and the DCMS through the drafting, but primarily Ofcom as the regulator in this space, are focusing on is making sure that organizations take a sort of largely tech-first approach to addressing some of these challenges. So it'd be really good to know, in addition to some of the great work that we know organizations that we work with are doing, what this level of feedback that you've had with regulators when you've, for instance, given them your recommendations based on research.
So I think what we've seen right now that regulators have done so far, these are obviously a lot of the collaborations we've gone into very recently, because this has been, it's been a topic for many years now, but it's taken very long to get these, both the legislation for it to actually pass, and as well as for us to establish these partnerships. So I don't have that many cases to speak off of. But what we see so far have been obviously, strong advocacy campaigns coming out of Ofcom based on our research. But I would say even more important is the fact that they have maybe a different understanding now than they had before of what is possible technically as well. So I would say that upskilling element, when you look at these collaborations and what they're actually actioning based on what we are giving them, It doesn't have that much to do with right now. I wouldn't say it has that much to do with the actual data that we are providing them. It's showing that there is data to be provided, and that opens up many, many avenues of research when it comes to what I mentioned before, say, how do you use a single model to then really be able to look more horizontally across harms and integrate different types of abuse or harm into a single model that's been trained on something very specific. So I'd say, the upskilling element is probably the main outcome, rather than right now actioning single bits of information.
Yeah. And I'm going to come back to this at the end of the session, but given the sort of lead time that we have between now and when organizations are actually going to need to comply with most of these obligations, I think it's safe to assume that there will be a lot more empirical data and research in this space as we sort of get between now and what should be mid of 2024 before this actually does kick in. So with that, we're going to, from an organizational compliance perspective, I'm going to hand back to Ioana, who's going to take us through some of the transparency and safety design obligations in the bill as it stands.
Thanks, Arnav. So I think building on this need for information in the space, there's been quite a heavy push towards transparencies from organizations to the regulator under the online safety bill, and the announcements from last week only underscored that. There was already an existing obligation to provide transparency reports to Ofcom on an annual basis under the bill. And Schedule 8 of the bill sets out quite a list of different types of information that Ofcom could request from organizations, such as the incidence of illegal content on the platform over a certain time period, the measures they have in place, and the risk assessments that they've undertaken. That list, as of yesterday, grew slightly longer with requests now that Ofcom may make regarding features and functionalities that organizations have implemented specifically to counter different types of harms and how those features map against the risks that they've identified. The announcement from last week shadowed that may continue to grow in terms of what organizations are requested to report to Ofcom, as well as what organizations will need to publish in a public sphere rather than just sharing directly with the regulator. So it's quite likely that we will soon see an obligation on organizations to publish parts of these transparency reports to the public. Equally, with respect to their users, there's quite a number of transparency obligations, and we're seeing more of those coming through now with respect to terms of service, which will need to include very clear and set out lists of what types of harms are being tackled and how content will be addressed. Will X type of content be removed? Will X type of content be flagged but left on the platform? Or will nothing be done about certain types of content? So it's going to be very interesting to see how organizations will be able to pick up these transparency requirements, both vis-a-vis users, the public, and the regulator. And what impact that's going to have on how organizations develop these terms of service in the first place. And very closely related to that is this concept of user empowerment, which I think was a foundational pillar of the online safety bill from the beginning, and it's one of the pillars that has remained very strong throughout the entire process. And I think part of that is a drive and a recognition that the fight isn't solely on the organizations, it's the users themselves as well. So there's a big push to have complaints processes very clearly set out and easily available and transparent to users to allow them to identify this content and flag it to the organization. There's obviously 1,001 different ways that these complaints procedures could be done in practice, and how you identify the flagging to users can have very practical effects on the efficacy of the project and what type of content ends up remaining on the platform. And I know that the Alan Turing Institute has done some very interesting research on that, so I'm going to hand over to Pica now to share some of those empirical findings.
Sure. So as you mentioned, the bill is really focusing a lot on shifting, or increasingly at least, especially considering the last few changes we've seen, trying to shift a lot of the focus from platforms making decisions to users making decisions themselves about what they're seeing, what they're consuming, to remove the platforms from being in the position of deciding, of course, some things need to stay, some things need to go by law, and that will remain the case. But there are lots of other types of content that we're now seeing a push to having users, be empowered and feel empowered to make these decisions for themselves. What we've been looking at the Turing is, in particular, reporting mechanisms and why users tend to use user flags or use these reporting mechanisms that are in place. And this is also actually research that we've seen. Ofcom, they've put out a survey for many years now that increasingly does focus on online harms. And what the joint kind of research does show is, of course, that users are not using the reporting mechanism a lot. And they are also, they're most likely not using it because they do not know what happens once users have reported something. So there's no follow-up from the platforms, or very poor follow-up. And also that the process of reporting isn't very clear to them. So I think that in itself is something that we are continuing to look into more with use of experiments as well. So that's something that's been surveyed many times, but we are now looking into how much more additional information do users need to feel like they actually are willing to engage with this type of mechanism. But also, at what point is there too much information? And for that reason, will they fall off the other side? So it is a very, very fine balance when it comes to giving them enough incentive to actually go through the reporting process without having them, get to the 10th step and having their 100th page of reading to do. So it becomes very similar to like the terms of service, where you just scroll and then end up at the end clicking something and not really knowing what happens. But I would say in general, the next bit of research that we're currently undertaking that I think is really interesting looks into this big difference in safety technology, which has to do more with reporting, appeals processes, deciding if you want to see comments, say comments or likes, either on your pictures, but also having, anonymized accounts, not allowing them to comment on your content, say, for example, which is really a group of safety tech that either targets specific pieces of content or specific users, which I think is what we focus a lot on right now. But I think there's a second research area which is really interesting, which is more to do with what we're seeing now in the bill, which has to do with how users experience different harms online and their experience more generally on the platforms. And there's a lot of offerings actually from these different platforms already in terms of providing, say, lists of keywords, for example, on a platform like TikTok, which then automatically removes that type of content from your feed. It has to do, there's also options on YouTube, for example, to disable YouTube from using your searches to then provide you recommendations. And many of these technologies do already exist. And what we then start asking ourselves is why are people not using these? Like, if we are trying to put more emphasis on the users really taking control over what they see online, if that's the way to go. I'm not entirely sure if that is, an excellent solution when we see that we already have a lot of these technologies on the platforms, but they're not being used. So our next research that we're currently drafting is, what technologies exist, who are using them, why are they using them, and why are certain maybe demographics exposed to even having these options, more upright or much more clearly presented to them in their feeds and being recommended to use certain features when they clearly do exist but are not really being adopted at all by users in the space as of right now.
Yeah. And it really is a fascinating space, isn't it? Because for those of you who attended our session last year, where we focused on transparency and design under the ICO Children's Code with speakers from the Children's Privacy Unit at the ICO, would have seen that we got some incredible feedback both in that session but also from their empirical research, and it really highlights the importance of regulators, private organizations, design researchers, and sometimes hopefully lawyers working together on some of these projects. Some of the things that come out of this, for those of us that are otherwise buried in fine print, drafting privacy notices, sort of attempting to put in place new mechanisms for GDPR compliance, for instance, have seen what the scale of challenge that lies in making meaningful information, in making information meaningfully available to users online. I think it continues to be a reasonably challenging task, but the fact that we do have access to this data, that we have actual feedback, actionable feedback, that not just organizations but regulators are getting, is a really interesting point. I think one thing that the online safety bill doesn't directly focus on, but is having a knock-on effect based on some of the discussions that I've been having, is transparency, reporting of transparency publications and what the impact that's likely to have. So obviously there's the user empowerment focus, which is what we're working backwards from at the moment. But there's a whole sort of piece around what publishing this sort of information, a lot of which I guess parallels can be drawn to in the financial services space, where these disclosures have been made for many years. We're seeing a lot of ESG reporting coming down the pipeline, which is likely to have a similar effect, where these could be seen as at a more societal level as good for overall transparency, but also to sort of move the dial when it comes to being a competitive advantage for these organizations who are looking to showcase some of the really good work that they are doing. At the moment, there's no real incentive to do that. But having these reports published through, for instance, Ofcom, I think would be a really good positive step forward. Great. So that sort of brings us along to the final session, which is what do organizations, where do they stand and what should they be doing next? Now, on the online safety bill, the hope is that it makes its way through Parliament before the current session ends, which is in April. Although I think that's asking for, that's being rather optimistic at this point, given all of the news that I'm sure you've all been reading, but we've got our fingers crossed. Ofcom, which is the regulator, as you know, is then going to be publishing several codes of practice for use by organizations that are likely to be in scope of the online safety law. They've helpfully recently published a roadmap for what they plan to do in the first 100 days of their powers coming into force. And these are going to include steps like drafting various pieces of codes and guidance, as well as enforcement guidelines on how Ofcom plans on enforcing the online safety law. We expect the first codes of practice to enter into force towards the middle of 2024. Interestingly, the Digital Services Act is likely to be fully or largely in force about 6 months before then. So from a practical standpoint, much of what our advice is focusing on with clients who we're supporting on that journey is making sure that we take a holistic view of what their, for instance, GDPR compliance program looks like. At the moment, lots of really good hard work on many of these issues has gone into this work over the last 4 or 5 years. Some of the work that has been happening over this year and will continue to happen over the course of next year on the Digital Services Act, which, again, as Ioana highlighted, has many, many overlapping themes, helpfully overlapping themes in some regards. So translating all of the good work that's happening there into work that could and should be done for compliance with the online safety law is something that's another huge area of focus for us. overall, I think a lot remains to be seen. There's a lot of room for delegated legislation by the Secretary of State. As some of you may be aware of, a lot of codes of practice, as I mentioned, that are going to come from Ofcom itself. So we're waiting to see what happens there. But at the moment, a lot of the focus continues to be on engagement with Ofcom, with DCMS, and seeing what happens in Parliament. I think with that, we're happy to open the floor to questions, and I believe we may also have some questions from our audiences online.
I think we have a microphone that can go around the room.
Sorry about that. I'm quite curious because I look at the regulation. It has included the metaverse-related environments in the online safety bill. So would you be able to provide a little bit more details? Because our biggest concern is a lot of legislation, it will prefer the user to report any unpleasant experience. But we all know with metaverse, those kind of VR, AR, XR, and different wearables and sensors, maybe they might be capture information that creating long-term damage for the physical or the mental health of the user. So how could we include that in the online, safety bill moving forward? Thank you.
Ioana, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I think the starting point is that the definition of user-to-user services is quite broad. And we've had a lot of conversations with DCMS and other industry groups over the last few months on these kind of fringe cases, be it VR, be it business to business, for which there's no explicit exception in the bill either, but we understand it isn't meant to be in the scope of it. So I think we will have to have some very challenging conversations as we go forward on the scope of who exactly is caught within this, what are the likely impacts to be. I think one of the main questions that I'd have is whether they'd be looking at anything that could be considered VR to be category 1, because obviously those are going to be very large platforms with a huge amount of users, and are you going to be treating that with more stringent obligations, or are you perhaps going to say VR does have a large number of users, but given the nature, it's either not covered by the bill at all, or it's covered but only as a category 2B service. So I think that's a very interesting area, but definitely one where we'll need to wait for further guidance on as well.
And I suppose one gap that exists, and I have to admit, not looked into the specific metaverse update on this in a huge amount of detail, but given that there's a focus when it comes to specific other updates, so we've seen, for instance, on there's new updates on obviously not just offences for children, but upskirting and downblousing and others very specific priority offences making their way into the draft bill. There's obviously nothing that's likely to be the specific focus of the sorts of harms and offences that could be committed in the metaverse. So you're then looking at the slightly broader set of compliance requirements that organizations will have to consider in the first instance, which makes it a little bit harder to pin down what sort of harm or offence you're actually looking at when it comes to metaverse users.
Sorry, right tucked in the corner. I'm Seb from Computer Weekly, and I just wanted to ask what your thoughts are on the, basically encryption breaking measures that are in the bill, client-side scanning, pre-encryption scans of content. Ministers are pretty adamant, including Scully, who we heard from this morning, saying that, it would only be used for child sexual abuse or terrorism, which, obviously any reasonable person is against those things. But encryption is important for safety as well. And there's nothing to say that it can't be repurposed down the line for other types of content. So I guess what are your general thoughts on those measures in the bill and how they actually impact safety? Because I'm not convinced it actually makes people safer to get rid of encryption.
I'm happy to, unless one of you has a specific view, share a personal rather than a firm view on that subject, which is that I agree with you that I don't think it's something that's likely to move the dial when it comes to safety. Encryption standards and technical sort of tools like encryption are built. They only work if they work in their totality. If you have exceptions to things like encryption, if you have exceptions to tools that are built around privacy and safety, having things like exceptions and backdoors, and we've seen what's happened with our friends in the United States when it comes to some of these backdoors being provided to other forms of services. When it comes to a world that's heavily reliant on end-to-end encryption, there is a balance to be struck in how fundamental rights online, when it comes to children's offences, when it comes to terrorism offences, should be how the balance between that and privacy and security need to be met. But I'm not sure that making something like that into the law is the right approach. It has to be one of several approaches that regulators are going to have to consider when they look to make sure that they're able to successfully enforce. A lot of that has been pushed onto organizations themselves. So when it comes to organizations coming up with ways in which they can monitor who's accessing what content and where, I think there are some approaches that also haven't been fully explored when it comes to things like age verification on specific types of services in scope of the online safety bill, for instance. So I think a graded response is the more appropriate response and something that takes a slightly more balanced view. I think that balance is unlikely to be struck if we have something like exceptions and backdoors to encryption standards.
And if I can just add on to that, with respect to these measures and child sexual exploitation, that's a concept that was actually raised earlier in the year by a European Commission proposal. So it's not something that I would say is entirely new under the online safety bill, though it's been expanded to include the terrorism aspect. And I think it's important to note that the regulatory environment for child privacy is very different, and there's a much more harmonized approach on that we've seen developing over the last year, largely following the UK's role model with the age-appropriate design code, or children's code as it's also called. And I think it's important to ground these measures in the context of child privacy is slightly its own beast that we need to deal with separately to online safety as well.
So a question for Pica. Someone is asking if you can provide any more information about about problems related to big data and how AI can help to solve this.
Sure. So I guess something that we in general struggle with content moderation when it comes to these AI-backed solutions is, of course, the fact that as soon as we are automatically removing something, we might be erring on the side of over removal. So I think anything that is powered by AI will have to have built into it a decision boundary in terms of if we want to be removing absolutely everything and be very certain of that, because some material we wouldn't want to see online, and therefore where we would actually be comfortable with removing things that are false positives. Or if, on the other hand, we absolutely, in all cases, want to protect freedom of expression and therefore want to err on the side of there might actually be a few instances that are still slipping through the cracks. And that's something that's fundamentally built into the model by whoever is training the data. So I think that's something we increasingly will be looking into over the next few years, and in terms of having really a diverse audience when it comes to the trainers of this data, because I think right now what we're seeing a lot is that a lot of huge tech platforms are using a very simplified or non-diverse understanding of what actually constitute abuse or not, but it can be incredibly contextual. So I think when we are looking forward, we're probably going to be seeing more examples where we either use a very big group of annotators to train the models, or start using more and more synthetic data where we try to, which is very difficult, but where we try to control for having more viewpoints actually integrated into the training data from the beginning. So those are maybe two future directions that I think we should keep an eye on.
Do we have time for any more?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question.
Fantastic, thanks. It's been a really interesting talk so far. My question really relates to what you were saying earlier about the lack of data in this field, or the lack of available data. And it reminds me very much of the transport industry, where, in Finland, they made great strides by encouraging the industry to share data. And that's really where mass came from in the transport sector. So I'm wondering, when it comes to content moderation, how are we going to encourage companies to share the valuable data they have, to enable other businesses and other organizations to make use of that data to protect young people from online harms?
So obviously there's still ongoing battle for the online safety bill specifically, if there might be provisions for researcher access to be part of the bill, which obviously I'm a huge proponent of. But we do see, even without researcher access, that there are huge pushes to make data available. So even if it isn't something that will come through in legislation, I think that will be considered the best practice within a few years' time. As Twitter has had an API for many years, that is the most common one used by researchers. YouTube just released their own API this summer. TikTok is currently coding up an API for researcher access as well. So I do think that has been moving quite quickly in a very short period of time, probably because this is something that is discussed on a global level already. So even now, if we see ourselves in a little bit of a of a crunch when it comes to only using the same data sets over and over again, or relying on very, very limited sources, I really do hope, and I'm quite optimistic, that even if it doesn't come through the online safety bill or similar legislation, it will be considered the gold standard for any serious platform that wants to be signaling that they do take user safety very seriously.
Yeah, and I think over the last few years, with a number of very, very large tech organizations have had very interesting approaches to how they make data about their users available. So we've had a few, as I mentioned, sort of stop-start approaches to these, where something's been done, some regulators had a problem, someone's taken someone to court, and then we've had to take them down. But there is a huge amount of really good work happening in this space through concepts like data trusts, for instance. That's something I know that Tech UK particularly focuses on. There's other organizations in the fray. I know we have some speakers here from the Open Data Institute that are hugely focused on making more and more data available through public data sets. And I think this would be a prime use case for data of that nature to be shared safely with regulatory oversight that we're expecting from Ofcom and others. So yeah, I think it's definitely a space to watch.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's all
Right,
we have.
sadly, apologies, that was my phone. It wasn't a prompt. We have to bring this fascinating conversation to a close. Can we just thank all our speakers, and also Clifford Chance for bringing this to the summit.